Hello, everybody. Great to see you, all of you. And Suhail,
Hello there.
Good to see you again, Suhail. Hope you're all doing well.
Hello. Yeah, good to be back speaking to a Fletcher audience.
Absolutely. So where is everybody physically? Geraldine, where are you?
I'm in Berlin, Germany, suburbia of Berlin, Germany.
Okay, wonderful. And Shamika?
I'm in France, just across from Geneva.
Okay, all right.
That's right. I'm in Washington, D.C.
All right. Well, I'm in the Boston area. So we have a pretty decent geographic spread, except we're talking about the global south and none of us are there.
Right. Hopefully we can use the experiences we've gained from working there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So did those questions that I sent around, I hope they sort of make sense, and feel free to improvise at least your reframing of the question, even if it, if it isn't spot on. And I'm hopeful that it gets us enough momentum to then have an organic conversation based on, what you hear your co-panelists speak. And Geraldine, is it okay for you to go first?
Yeah, is it more like, will you be asking the questions, or should we just jump in with a statement? You'll ask the questions and then
I think I'll ask. That sort of makes it a little bit more conversational.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Great.
I'm not, yes, it's correct, of course, that you pointed out the sort of geographical mismatch, but I've just come out of a data governance workshop for the city of Berlin. And I have to say, as much as I love my home city, there's a lot of development to do here. And unfortunately, a lot of, empty space to be filled in this area, so.
I can imagine.
Hello. Apologies.
Wow, you sound like you're in a cathedral, Jade.
Apologies about the. Oh, okay, that works. So hello to everyone, both in person and over Zoom. I just wanted to say a few things before the panel gets started, but it's a pleasure having everyone tune into this panel on data governance in the Global South. And so we have with us today our moderator, Professor Bhaskar Chakravorti, and our panelists, Dr. Shamika Siriman from the UN Conference on Trade and Development, Mr. Suhail Shersad of the World Bank, and Ms. Geraldine de Bastian, CEO and co-founder of Connective, a German development agency focusing on digital transformation. So I would love to have you all just introduce yourselves briefly, but just to frame the conversation, we hope to have foster a conversation that will be forward-looking, considering the future of data governance in the Global South based on lessons learned during the pandemic and beyond. And we also hope to fuel a debate over the benefits or disadvantages of regulation in promoting entrepreneurship and economic growth in emerging markets. So thank you again for tuning in and for being here, panelists.
Well, thank you, Jade, and thank you to all of you who are joining, those of you who are at Fletcher, and those of you who are outside the four walls of Fletcher in kind of the wider world, which in many ways is where Fletcher lives. And speaking of Fletcher, we have a Fletcher alum here, and then friends of Fletcher across the screen. So it is a real privilege to have an opportunity to talk about a topic that is so enormously important to everything we do in the digital world. So just by way of quick introduction, what I'll do is I'll just introduce myself and then ask my colleagues on the panel to introduce themselves and just say a little bit about the organizations that they lead and are a part of, so that we can contextualize, their observations. So my name is Bhaskar Chakravorti. I'm the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School. I also direct the Institute for Business in the Global Context and run a research program called Digital Planet. And I'll take a couple of minutes at the top to talk about some work relating to data governance that we've been doing in Digital Planet to set the table. But the real experts are Geraldine de Bastian, Dr. Shamika Sirimanne, and Suhail Shersad. And if I could ask Geraldine, if you could just say a few words about yourself and your organization.
Sure, thank you so much for having me here today. So my name is Geraldine Bastian. I'm based in Berlin, Germany, and I'm the CEO of, as was already said by Jay, thank you, Connective, which works at the intersection of especially open source technologies, digital transformation, and development cooperation, although we also work for other government entities in other fields, sometimes to advise also German government and other stakeholders on their digital transformation processes. And apart from Connective, I'm also head of a network called the Global Innovation Gathering, which is a network of different kinds of innovation hubs, so physical places where digital innovation takes place across the world, with the majority of our members being based in the Global South. And much of my work really revolves around the intersection of digital rights topics and digital innovation topics, both internationally and in Germany, where I get to be on the Smart City Board of our city Berlin, and also deal with data governance issues on a very local level here. Thank you.
Fantastic, Geraldine. And you are coming to us from the outskirts of Berlin. Is that right?
That is right.
All right. Fabulous. Shamika.
Thank you, Bhaskar. Good to be here. My name is Shamika Siriman. I'm the director of the Division on Technology and Logistics of UNCTAD, and UNCTAD is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. It's basically the UN's focal point on the interrelated treatment of trade, finance, and technology. And I don't know whether many of you know, and this organization was created in 1964 by developing countries for developing country needs. So it's a very special organization. I think many of you know the G77. It was created by G77 to address the concerns of G77 in integrating to the global economy. And I think it's kind of sad when you look at this 1964 statement, the many issues that they raised then remain the same, and they have become even more aggravated with this new, this technological revolution in front of us. So the work that I do is really doing a lot of analytical work. Like, we are very preoccupied by this whole data, cross-border data governance issues, because this is, to us, data is a development issue. So we are quite concerned. Are we living in a technological revolution? And is this revolution is going to miss like the large populations in developing continents? Would they lose out yet again enormous technological revolution? So our work is to do analytical work to see what works and what doesn't work on policy front, to advise the ministers on trade, ICT, and others on preparing for digital e-commerce and the digital economy. And we do assessment in countries, especially in LDCs, to see how ready they are for this emerging new economy. So that's the kind of, assessing, helping, building capacity on the regulatory systems. I think this is something that we are going to be discussing, because this is a huge void in developing countries. And so this is the kind of stuff we do: analysis, intergovernmental work, and capacity building.
Fantastic. So it seems like we're going to be privy to a terrific set of perspectives from the ground up. If you think about grassroots innovation and entrepreneurial hubs, and how data governance has an impact on that, to a macro view of cross-border activity and development, and the role of data and data governance rules, how that might have an impact on development from a macro perspective. Suhail, say a few words about yourself and what you do at the World Bank.
Sure. So it's such a pleasure to be here, back speaking to a Fletcher audience. Since graduating from Fletcher, I've gone on to work at the World Bank, where currently I'm with the Digital Development Global Practice. What we do is essentially work with various governments, mostly in the developing world, to try and aid their journey towards digital transformation and towards exploiting the digital economy for their country's development and welfare. Most of the issues that I work with on a daily basis include questions of digital infrastructure and infrastructure financing, as well as the regulation and governance of technology and the digital space, but also more application-based areas such as digital entrepreneurship, scale building, and so on.
Fantastic. So we have a third perspective, which is going to be, really enrich this discussion. Now, if I were to kind of step back and, just, ask the simple question of, what are we talking about when we say data governance? And, most of the time we are spending our many hours, and of course, the last 2 years, much of our hours staring at screens, whether it was a laptop or a phone or some other kind of a screen. And every time you just have that screen in front of you, you are generating data. And in fact, you don't even have to have the screen in front of you. The screen is with you and you're walking around and you generate data. And much of the time we don't think about it. And occasionally we worry about what's happening to that data, who's got access to it, who might be harnessing it. Are they harnessing it for services that are useful to us? Or are they harnessing it for their individual purposes? And is that harnessing being done by private entities, by the public sector, by governments? I don't even know whether it's our own government or some other government. And when we think about data governance, much of the time, for most of us, even for a highly educated audience like this, we think about data governance in the context of privacy, protections, perhaps a degree of control in terms of who gets access. Am I allowed to give permission actively, or is it automatically sort of taken? Is that right being taken away from me? And then in an international setting, there are issues to do with data localization and how much data is allowed to cross borders. And beyond that, we don't think a whole lot about what is happening with all this data. And of course, on the other hand, we hear a lot about the gigantic reservoirs of data being collected by the big tech players or by governments. And this is a huge issue. And of course, we know that as we continue to go further into a data-intensive economy, data is the fuel that is going to generate the next frontier of productivity and growth. And I find it quite helpful to break down the notion of data governance by sort of 6 categories that one of our terrific research partners at Digital Planet has helped us create. Her name is Susan Aronson. She's a professor at George Washington University. And she gave us a really helpful categorization to think about data governance. One criterion is whether the government has plans for different contexts of data use and reuse. And you can actually score different governments along those lines. The second is, does the government have a legal regime around data types and their use? A third is whether the government thinks about the ethical issues to do with trust building, the human rights implications of data use and reuse. So you can see that each of these are related, but they are actually fairly distinct elements in this larger structure of governance. A fourth is, does the government alter the institutional structures in response to data-driven transformation? A fifth is whether the government informs its constituencies about the activities that it is engaging in terms of data governance and reform, and asks for public comment with the intention of incorporating their feedback. And the sixth is whether the government joins with other parties, other governments, in sharing international efforts to establish data governance rules, norms, broader agreements. So you can say that this notion of data governance is actually quite a complex structure. So now coming down from that complexity, let's make this real. And if I could go to you first, Geraldine, help us understand how this superstructure of data governance, that we know that this superstructure is still being built. We are nowhere near having fixed this. Perhaps Europe is the first out of the gate at having laid some kind of a construct, and other countries are using that as a way to either replicate it or as a departure point. There are different regimes that are evolving, and the most divergent kinds of regimes have to do with the governance of privacy and private data. So as you think about data governance, and particularly in relation to data coming out of the global south, how does it have an impact on grassroots innovation, on entrepreneurs, regardless of where they're situated? They could be in Berlin or in Bombay. And I guess the question is, why do they care, and why does it matter?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, and thank you so much for your introduction. As you just said, this is very much all about setting the goalposts in a way that we can strive to work towards futures that are livable for all and desirable for all. So as we are moving on in this data-driven era of decision making and the era of AI, it's important to see how can we create these frameworks right today in order for everybody in our societies globally to profit from these developments equally and not just to benefit few. So as you also outlined a little bit, we have this current situation where a lot of our private data has been sucked up by big tech companies and has been siloed there. And we have governments that have sometimes yet to understand the value of data and are trying to catch up in many ways. At least this is what it feels like in some ways in Europe. A lot of governments have awoken to the fact that they need to sort of get in on the game of being able to understand the value of data, perhaps even collect data themselves, to govern this data, and then to see how they can use it for public decision making and other related purposes. So at the moment, there's this idea of regaining some innovation power within governments as well, which I personally think is a good idea, but of course also opens some doors to questions of how do we build architectures that really support digital sovereignty and digital sovereignty from a citizen's perspective and not just from a government perspective, instead of building architectures of surveillance. So maybe just a quick point on Germany before moving into the international perspective. I found it very interesting that we have a new government as of recently, and in their coalition treaty in the sector about development cooperation, there's a paragraph on the relevance of digital sovereignty, but to see it not as an effort to create new silos and to sort of shut oneself out from the rest of the world, but how to create systems of cooperation and how to understand digital sovereignty as a global undertaking and also a way to work in partnership with global South countries and citizens. And I find that a very interesting and important perspective because, like I said earlier, I feel having this underlying idea of building digital sovereignty is important, but at the same time, looking at it from a European country point of view, it's important that we don't, as I just said, create new silos and shut out, but to create new resources and opportunities. And of course, this is why I think it matters also from a grassroots organization perspective, whether it's a commercial organization, a startup perhaps, or a digital rights initiative, involving citizens from the beginning in the design of data governance policies and also in the implementation of data governance systems and data collection systems, I believe is of high importance in order to build democratic and sustainable structures in this area. So on the one hand, in order to be able to create like checks and balances from a citizen point of view, and there are many great examples of citizen science initiatives or other initiatives that enable citizens to do their own data gathering to create these new kind of checks and balances with citizens. So just one quick example, proudly also connected to my network, is an initiative from Brazil called Data Lab, which really works together with citizens and purveyors to gather infrastructure data, data that could be used for city planning processes, and sort of create a counter narrative or their own narrative that they can then use to engage with city authorities to make sure that their interests are also met and designed for. And so these kind of initiatives and the sort of access to creating one's own data, or at least an understanding of why data is important and useful, is, I think, important from this democratic point of view. Of course, it's also important when we're thinking about who can innovate on top of data and databases. So again, another very quick example, perhaps, we know that big tech companies are busy setting up their AI centers across the world, for instance, Google in Ghana, and who gets to make sure that local startups also profit from data gathering purposes and get to innovate on top of of other developments taking place, whether it's governments collecting data or big tech companies. So to create new systems of data sharing in the broader sense, of open data in a more classic sense perhaps, and for local entities to be able to innovate on top of that, I think is also important for further economic development of societies. So maybe I'll just stop there for first notes.
Fantastic. Thank you for leading us off, Geraldine. And as I was listening to you, and I'll come to my other panelists, but I do have a follow-up question. And the follow-up question has to do with, I'm wondering, and this is a term or a phrase that has gone out of fashion, but I'll bring it back. Move fast and break things, right? And we all know where that originated and where that particular company is today. Now, the whole notion of move fast and break things is the opposite of governance, which is, just wild free for all, just gotta go for it. And there are people who argue that the wild free for all is the best environment for innovation, and eventually there's almost a Darwinian process, whether it's Google in Ghana or maybe it's a Ghanaian entrepreneur that wins, or maybe Google does because they are so big. But ultimately, innovation thrives in an environment where there is no governance. And I'm deliberately being provocative, and I'm curious about what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I would say that's very much a Silicon Valley driven narrative that I personally would not sign up for entirely, at least not in the sense that I don't think innovation takes place in the best of sense, at least in the best interest of our societies in a governance free zone. And I think we're seeing a lot of rethinking of those kind of approaches and ideas put forward. I mean, just looking at developments taking place in the US with the government of California trying to get Uber to understand that their drivers are in fact employees of their company, and to very much pedal back on this disruption of certain certain industries and certain labor rights. That has really not been in the interest of the people involved working for these companies, or the people trying to collect taxes from these companies, looking at it again from a European point of view, that they can then use for other social services and social goods in their own lines of decision making, and not those driven by the companies themselves when they engage in their sort of altruistic forms. So yeah, I'm glad that we're seeing a lot of this sort of rethinking taking place. And of course, we see many great examples where innovation comes from unexpected places and, let's say, resource poor environments. But I believe there's a lot of power, a lot of strive for retaining power behind those narratives, because they come from places of power and affluence that are trying to project their models on other places in the world, and not so much from places where, those kind of power structures perhaps are very different and not, again, not serving the interest of the people necessarily.
Fantastic. I think that's a perfect segue to Shamika, because Shamika, in your introduction, you said that you were and your colleagues are increasingly worried about how this asymmetric power structure, which has existed for decades, is now become far worse, in this largely ungoverned data environment. And so I guess the question to you, Shamika, is what kinds of international data governance principles are most conducive for development as you see it? And a follow-on is, what are the risks that keep you up at night of the lack of governance?
Let me start with the what keeps me awake at night question, because this is a real preoccupation for us in UNCTAD. I think you mentioned, Bhaskar, at the beginning. You see, data is not just an economic issue. Data is a strategic. This is a strategic issue that it's a strategic resource. So if well managed, this data can help address some of the global development challenges, talk about climate change, pandemics and so forth, and really create the development gains. But if they are badly managed, data can generate highly unequal development outcomes, and it could undermine the functioning of the internet. And this is a real concern. I know we all know these numbers. We all talk a lot about the connectivity divide. Today, there are 40% of the world is not yet connected, which is quite sad and not acceptable. My worry now is that there is, on top of that connectivity divide, a data divide is emerging. And this will ultimately lead to a massive development divide, and it will be very difficult to, bridge. What do I say when I talk about data divide? I'm talking about the data divide between those who collect, store, analyze, make intelligence out of data, and then sell it, mainly the digital platforms. I think we already started to talk a bit about that. And then you have those who provide data free for these platforms, and then buy intelligence created by the platforms. And that divide, I don't see that divide is closing. We see that divide is widening. Let's just be honest here. When you talk about digital realm, there are only two players. There's US and there's China, and there is the rest of the world. Okay, when you look at the platforms, the big platforms of the world, 90% of the biggest platforms are owned by these two countries. And in fact, we have seen numbers, and we have come up with our digital economy report 2021 that looks at this whole data for development issue, cross-border data. That was the angle we looked at because we are a trade organization. And we saw during this period of COVID-19 that these platforms of these two countries have strengthened their positions along the entire global data value chain, from data collection to transmission to storage to data analysis, and for instance, increasingly using AI. So unless there is data sharing beyond these platforms, and it will be extremely difficult to create value for others. And forget about addressing global problems. So this is the concern. So let me then come to your second part, the principles of governance. So this is why we need some sort of a balanced global governance approach that would work for people and the planet, not for a few, but for the many. So the way we see the principle, you talk about the principles, that should be to enable data to flow as freely as necessary and possible, while being able to address various developmental objectives. So this is how we see the overarching principles of global governance. Now, there is no global governance now. I'll get to that. There are three forms of governance and there's no convergence. I'll get to this. But what do we need? Some sort of a global governance. This is to avoid further fragmentation of the digital space, to enable global data sharing, to enhance trust in the digital economy, and to also to govern this digital, giant digital platforms. I think we need a framework within which not the few, but everybody should come to table and assess this thing. Now, when you look at what kind of data governance systems are there are only three models right now. I think there is a model. This is the US model, the Chinese model, and the European model. And there is no convergence between these three models. And I think, but there is a lot of tension, as we know. When we hear news, there's a lot of tensions between these three models. You see, I think you also mentioned the approach, it's a bit simplifying the whole thing, but the approach of the US is very much on control of the data by the private sector. This is a private sector business. It's up to the private sector. And then you have the Chinese model emphasizes control of data by the government. And then you have the European Union, model favoring control of data by individuals. So it's thus, there are three different models based on three different developmental objectives, national development objectives of these countries. But the problem now, I think this is something I want to put to you, is very few developing countries have any form of development, the data governance frameworks that address their own developmental needs. Instead, they are increasingly obliged to align themselves with the data governance frameworks of their dominant trading partners. And this is not a developmental solution. This is not acceptable. So this is why we need a global data governance framework, I said. So let me say, where can this be? This can only be in the UN, because this is the only place, this is the place where developing countries have a place at the table, because they are not in any of these digital discussions. They are not in these three, of course, except China. They are not in these big digital discussions happening, among these, the US, the China, and the EU, and they're not in G20, and they're not in the places where these discussions are taking place. And that place for them would only be the UN. It's the most inclusive forum. And of course, it's also had to be multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, and multilateral process. And this is where we need to do something. And as you know, the only extremely difficult systemic issues normally land in the UN. You talk about the climate change, the nuclear disarmament, and they all somehow land there. And this is, to me, this is another systemic, a big issue. But I'm just a UN staff, so I have no voice of gathering the United Nations to do anything. It's the member states' business. And the member states are driven by their own citizens, meaning like you, the academia, the intellectuals, and the Greta Thunbergs of the world. And we need those to convince their member states, and then all member states need to come to one place and start having a discussion on governance. And I am quite worried that this new divide called data divide would never be bridged. It's a real concern.
Great. So thank you for these observations, Shamika. In fact, it seems like drawing the analogy from the climate conversations, what we need is a data Thunberg for our, the digital analog of the climate crisis. But I do have a follow-up. I apologize. This is Friday afternoon. That's the best. That's the best. One-liner I could bring up. It's been a long week. So one follow-up question for you. So Nandan Nilekani, founder of Infosys in India, and also the creator of the Aadhaar system, the unique ID system in India, which is quite a remarkable construct in some ways. And it's also a gigantic storage of data, and there are lots of issues to unravel over there. He had once made the point that people in India are going to be data rich before they are rich. And he had framed that as a positive aspect of the developing countries or global south. He was speaking about India, but he was basically speaking for the global south, which is people have access to mobile phones, and their ability to generate data could give them a certain degree of power and leverage. And I'm wondering how you feel about that, and does that, to some extent, make you feel a little bit better when you wake up in the middle of the night worrying about these issues?
No, this is a very good question. I mean, if you're a billion people, as you said, you're in front of your computer, you're walking away from your computer, the data is being gathered. So it's all very good. So there are enormous amount of data is being gathered. But what do we do with this data? How, it's just a bunch of data sitting there is one thing. But how do we store this data, analyze this data, create intelligence out of this data, and share with the population? I mean, that's where the gaps in developing countries are. And that's where only few platforms are able to do that. But the problem in the digital economy is that it's a very, it's tend to be quite, these platforms tend to be quite monopolistic as a natural monopoly, because they have the network effects, the first movers advantage, then they become the, massive data collectors. Like if I'm in Facebook, all my 50 friends are in Facebook, I'm not going to go into another book because we are all there, because it's already the network is created. So these network effects, these first mover effects, you know, they tend to consolidate these platforms, and it's very difficult for others to break in. The competition becomes much less. I think it's the nature of the platforms. So what, yes, we will have lots of data in the global south. What we do with that data, and if we can analyze, you know, create intelligence and share with our populations, and there will be enormous benefits. And I would like to see it, but I don't see it yet.
Yeah. So I think it's we'll come back to this question. It's an interesting conversation to be had about how does one potentially reframe data in terms of other industry language that that we may have some governance principles around. So I'll give you an example. There is one way to frame data generation as labor. So every time you swipe your finger on a piece of glass, you're actually the labor for the digital industry, and you're generating data. So in the spirit of labor being organized in labor unions and then creating negotiating power against those big giants, you know, is there a model of data unions? And so again, I don't want to go there, but I think those are the kinds of things that I would love for everybody here on the panel and all our audience members also to think about, because, you know, we're talking about data as an abstract concept, but there are some ways in which this problem you know, has an analog from our analog past. But let me turn to Suhail. Suhail, so you are, you know, you're looking at development issues across the global south, and certainly digital development, you know, being an enormously important vector, you know, of growth. And can you speak to how data contributes to advancing these development pathways, and perhaps even give us some examples? We could just sort of situate us in some tangible ways in which data is an accelerator for inclusion and growth.
Sure. So I agree with my panelists that definitely the predominant conversation today about the digital economy is not whether digitalization and digitization is positive or a negative, but more of a conversation about how can we reap the benefits, how can we reap the positives and minimize and mitigate the risks which are inherent, and I think that everyone on every side of this discussion understands that both of those exist simultaneously. In the development context, therefore, most of my work, working with client governments, is in trying to find a way in which we can define those risks and mitigate those risks which exist. Now, about the question of what data actually represents, I do think that, of course, it's important to consider the common usage of the term, which is how data is recorded by private companies through our phones and various other screens that we're using, laptops, and so on and so forth. But I would also like to flag that there is actually a lot of data which exists in a lot of filing cabinets and in a lot of dusty shelves in government offices in analog format today. And as that data is being digitalized, there are many questions of data governance which appear right at that outset. So data governance questions, if we are looking at them at the stage at which a private sector company is already using that data for a particular purpose, and then you try and bring that company to heel, in a manner of speaking, it's almost too late already at that point. It really has to start at the very beginning of the data value chain, so to speak, which happens at the collection or conversion stage itself. Now, speaking of the benefits in the development sphere, there, of course, the examples are innumerable. A very prominent example from one of the leading countries in the digital sphere, Estonia, is that Estonia has what they call an ask once policy in e-government, where, for example, if you're applying for a driver's license in Estonia and you provide, let's say, your address or some other personal details of yours, then at no other point will another government agency in Estonia ask you for that same point of information. For example, if you're going for like a police verification certificate, and for me as an Indian citizen, you know, I've had to go through those things personally in my own life, and every single time you have to provide 3 hard copies of the same document and run from pillar to post to get those things done. In Estonia, they have this ask once policy to sort of ensure that there is an onus on the government to innovate. Now, the issue is, of course, that that's all well and good in Estonia, but when you're looking at countries across the world, there are different points of departure. So 2 data governance case studies that I was a part of co-authoring last year as a part of the World Bank's World Development Report 2021, which is about data for better lives, was on Jordan and Morocco. And these are 2 vastly differing countries, though they are relatively close to each other on the global scale of things. In Jordan, there was an issue of interoperability, where when this data is being converted from those dusty shelves and cabinets into various different formats, then there has to be certain data standards that are maintained to make sure that there is a level of interoperability, comparability, and so on between various agencies. Now, what does that help you achieve? For example, if a program has to be targeted towards its citizens, whether that's a stimulus program or a safety net, or whether that's an education voucher or a healthcare program, then these tools help speed up that process and vastly increase the efficiency. Because as we all know, rather than someone, it would be a lot faster than someone digging through these cabinets to find your document and come back to you weeks and weeks into the future. But there is another benefit as well, which is that in some way it has the opportunity to, at a very high level, almost renew the social contract and improve public trust. Because if you go to a government office and you've been standing in line for an hour and a half and you reach the front of that line, but now the person behind the counter goes to lunch, now you have to go back home, you haven't completed what you intended to do, then that citizen might feel incentivized in some way, almost, to seek another back channel to try and solve their governance issues or receive that government service. What technology and what data allows is for increased transparency and accountability, where if you are perhaps filling out an online form or if you know your position in the queue, then it vastly increases the amount of trust that people have in those institutions as well. So that would be a very important dimension as well. And there are many countries that we work with where even the process of digitization itself can be a very complex one. So it's very important to begin this conversation right at the outset, because if we wait too long to have these discussions of data governance, such as on consumer rights and user privacy and so on, then the example is right before our eyes, because we see that in the US and in many other developed countries or industrialized countries, advanced economies, they're struggling with this notion right now. And I think that in developing countries, it's very important to really come to terms with what these priorities are, as the other panelists were saying, and try and have that discussion as early as possible so that we can benefit as many people as possible.
Great, thank you for that, Suhail. And the Estonia example certainly resonates, and I wish we had some version of that at Fletcher, because every time I have to log into a computer in a classroom, it's like breaking into a series of Swiss banks, because every single screen you have to re-enter all your credentials and the system never seems to remember. In any case, I don't want to share my personal pain with digital here, but there are a couple of different directions I'd love to go, based on this, terrific foundation that the 3 of you have helped us sort of set out. One direction that I'd like to go is sort of building on, the clear need for governance and the clear need for an international a set of norms and agreements along the lines that Shamika was talking about. So I'd like to kind of drill into the question of who should be responsible for setting those governance principles and who should be at the table. So that's sort of one direction. And then a follow-on direction I'd like to go is reflecting on the last 2 years, which of course have been some of the most extraordinary years in all our lives for all the reasons we understand. But one very important factor is that we spent so much time generating data because we were spending so much time communing with our screens. So I'll take that second one later, but just to kind of keep that going in your head as to, what are the pandemic lessons in terms of data governance. So the first question here is, when we say we need governance, the automatic term that comes to mind is governance comes from governments. And so can we actually trust governments to do this right? And again, I'm going to be a bit provocative. Is there a risk that governments come in and set governance rules, but they don't quite understand the technology? The technology is moving too fast. And so they're always a few steps behind. So is it possible that the rules are being set? And we saw examples of this when the Zuckerbergs were being hauled up on Capitol Hill, and literally, a lawmaker asked Zuckerberg, how do you make money? And the guys said, Senator, we sell ads. And it was clear that they hadn't done their homework. And there's an element of that in every government in the world. So that's one concern, which is they don't quite get it. The second is there are many governments that can't be trusted. Right, and particularly, it's not just global South governments, global North governments can't be trusted. There is concerns about surveillance, there's concerns about overreach, what's happening to that data, how is the government using that data? And we do know that there are many governments that are actually collecting this data to keep their eyes, to keep tabs on citizens. So question back to all of you is, who should be at the table, the ideal table that we'd like to assemble to construct the governance systems? Governments, the private sector, or civil citizens, or the civil society? Sorry, Geraldine, do you want to go first?
Yeah, maybe just to start us off, and also building on what Shamika already, I think, outlined really well, the importance, of course, for multi-stakeholder setups in these kind of processes. So as you said, there are many harrowing examples of what can happen if the right kind of data protection policies are not in place, citizens are not empowered, and kind of governments kind of run away with these ideas. One example, just to cite very quickly, from Zimbabwe, where a Chinese startup wanted to do a swap in terms of giving technology that can be used for security, but obviously also for surveillance reasons, and basically getting an export of Zimbabwean faces in return for this, in order to train their AI with a different set of faces than they had been able to expose it to before. So something where, of course, we all kind of get the creeps and know, okay, so no citizen was ever consulted, and the whole long haul of the effects of this are not taken into consideration. So, of course, it's absolutely necessary to have civil society stakeholders at the table, and public-private partnerships are great in many ways, but I do believe in this notion of bringing innovation potential back into governments, and then thinking further, how can we create systems where we don't put too much power and control in the hands of governments, thinking again about the long haul of these processes and the fact that we don't have democratic, transparent governments set up in all areas of the world. So there are some interesting ideas developing around what could different kind of data trusts or data stewardships look like, involving third-party entities that act as sort of data intermediaries between citizens and governments. I think an emerging number of interesting examples coming from around the world. There's an India-based research tank driven by an organization called ACTI that has done a lot of research into this. I can post the link to the chat in a minute, and has collected a number of interesting examples that we could perhaps learn from to see what could such systems look like in order just to design things the right way. Maybe just very quickly commenting on the Estonia example, which is of course also one that's very often used in Germany to say, oh, look, this is the way things could be going. I thought it was a really interesting insight when I got to talk to someone, because they've had a lot of open data repositories in cities, especially like municipal data available in a completely different way and scale than Germany has, but pointing out, saying they see the tendencies of the same private sector entities benefiting from these, the same players who are making money and profiting off of these. So how do we make sure that these kind of open data sets or repositories can really be used for the common public good and don't always serve to create a profit for the same kind of stakeholders, but really for populations at large? Thanks.
Yeah, so Geraldine, thank you for that, and thank you for providing some examples of data trusts and data intermediaries. And there are a number of really creative ideas that people are experimenting with. Certainly, the group in India you mentioned, iSpert, which is a foundation that Nilekani, who I was mentioning, he had started, and they have a system that they're experimenting with in India. Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the World Wide Web, he's got a pod model that he's developing. So lots of great experiments going on. And I also find it interesting the role that not just different constituencies play, like governments and companies or nonprofits and civil society, but also the role of history. So, and you're situated in Germany, and I find it really interesting, the distinction between, and I'm going to bleed over into our pandemic experience in terms of data collection during the pandemic. So one of the big ideas that people experimented with around the world was using data from citizens to figure out their exposure status. Were you COVID positive? Did you come into contact with somebody who's COVID positive? So essentially, those exposure identification schemes and contact tracing systems popped up around the world. And in a place like South Korea or Taiwan, they were extremely intrusive, and the citizens were okay. They said, take my data. I just want to make sure that I'm safe and everybody else is safe. They tried the same in Germany, and instantly there was a revolt. They said, no, you can't take our data and put it in a centralized place. There's a difference. There's a history that Germans have lived through, which makes them extremely worried about a centralized collection of data, whereas the South Koreans have lived through a different history of the MERS epidemic of 2015, and they said, never again, we're not going to do that. So I think history and culture and the larger socioeconomic context also plays an enormously important role in framing the degree to which governments are going to be activist in terms of managing data. Let me go to Suhail. Suhail, any perspectives on who should be at the table?
All right. I think that today the discussion is predominantly tending towards a multi-stakeholder framework. There are very few countries left right now that are still advocating for a purely multilateral model of data governance. Now, in that multi-stakeholder framework, of course, the question is who should be at the table, and in another sense, how much voting power should you have when you are sitting at the table? And that is something that I think has stalled conversations at the Internet governance forums and so on. On a slightly broader issue, just to zoom out a little bit further, the issue of trusting government. It is very hard to perhaps trust a government, but there is, even in those specific contexts, whether it's Germany or the USA or places where the government might be seen with a smidge of disdain, there is still perhaps a role to play, and that's moving away from being perhaps the gatekeepers into the digital sphere and into the data world, and instead becoming more of the arbiters and trying to gain an independent regulator who is separate from the world of politics. Now, in many countries in developing worlds, that is very difficult to do. Even if on paper there is an independent regulator, if that regulator, if the head of the regulator is appointed by an elected official or a minister, then there can still be questions as to whether that is truly an independent regulator, and are the decisions being made truly made in an independent fashion with the best interests of people in mind. So this discussion of trust is a very important one, but at the end of the day, there will always be a question of who watches the watchman, to borrow a phrase. But that does not mean that we can, at the same time, throw the baby out with the bathwater and leave this very important space where so many rights are at stake solely to the private sector or solely to private corporations. Now, it is important to note that private corporations have also taken a number of different steps on their own to build that trust and to try and instill a sense of trust in their own actions within the public. So you have these many different stakeholders who are sitting at this multi-stakeholder table, and they must vie at the end of the day to determine how much voting power they receive at the end of that process. But I would say that as far as 2022 is concerned, this is an incomplete discussion. A clear answer to this has not yet emerged. And I think that across the board, the consensus seems to be that it has to be some kind of mixed model, but the answer to exactly precisely how much percentage of voting rights each stakeholder group should receive is one that we don't yet have the answer to, as far as I know.
Great, thank you, Suhail, for that. And I'd like to come to you, Shamika. We're sort of coming full circle. You mentioned that this table needs to be set by the UN, because that's all the kind of the natural body where the world sort of comes together. After listening to your colleagues on the panel, I'm wondering how you think about that table that might be set. Is the UN the right body? Does it have, because it's made up of member states, which are essentially governments. So do we have the right people at the table, or does something need to change?
Thank you. I think this is a very, very good discussion. You see, I know that when you think about the UN, we always think, this is the governments talking to each other, but it's not really the case. Increasingly, the UN forums have incorporated multi-stakeholder groups. So you see the governments and you see private sector, the NGOs, they're all in. But that's what we need to do. And to address this issue, I think I fully agree. If the private sector is not there, I don't think the governments can cook up the governance if there's no buy-in from the private big platforms. So I think everybody needs to be at the table, and there is no other place. That's what we have. All we have is the United Nations, and that's the place we have for this discussion. And I think private sector would also want some convergence. I mentioned these three big governance models, and there is no convergence between the American model and the Chinese model and the European model. They are all just walking on parallelly. And I think the private sector in these countries also need some interoperability, because they want to trade, and the trade is increasing. You need to have cross-border data flows for you to trade. And if you have internet walls, great walls covering your countries, or there are all kinds of other things, so it's not good for the private sector either. So I think everybody is ready, but somebody has to galvanize. This is why I said that we need the Greta Thunberg. But Bhaskar, if you give me 2 minutes, I want to address also, I think there was this idea, the regulation is no good, how much regulation. I just want to put a new, I want to give a new take, because we work in developing countries, and especially developing their ability to do e-commerce. And one of the biggest problems they have is not just the connectivity, but there is no regulatory framework. Because unless you have trust on a platform, I'm not going to put my credit card onto that platform and buy something. So I need to know that this platform the data is protected. I can send stuff back. So the consumer protection stuff, the data protection stuff, the cybersecurity is there. And who is going to do that? It's the government. So in fact, the e-commerce arena, or the digital economy arena, many countries are asking us to, they want the regulatory frameworks. They want their governments to come up with regulatory frameworks so that they can thrive. Because if you don't have these regulations, there is not going to be any trust on internet in that country. Nobody would do e-commerce. So don't even think about cross-border, engaging in international trade. That would not happen. So regulation is quite important.
Great. Yeah, I completely agree. I think regulation is important, and And then the issue is wise regulation is important, and that's really the question of how we get to that. And I also hear a chorus in terms of getting a multi-stakeholder conversation, a multi-stakeholder table to nail down these regulations and the guardrails and the governance systems. And then the problem is I start worrying whenever we talk about multi-stakeholders, because that immediately leads to a concern about cacophony, because these sectors don't really talk to each other. And even the notion of data and whose data is it? Like even right now, I'm seeing all four of your faces. So this piece of the screen, whom does it belong to? Does it belong to me because it's on my computer? Or does it belong to each one of us because each one of our faces is on this? And we haven't quite sorted it out. You know, digital rights is still a bit of a fuzzy concept. So there's so many hurdles for us to cross, which are important ones. We can't avoid them. And to Suhail's point, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have to, go right in and give the baby a bath. Anyway, I'm going to get lost in that really dangerous metaphor. So I'll just, we'll open this up for questions. But before we go there, let's do a lightning round. The lightning round being, the last 2 years, we have been spending time on our screen, generating enormous amounts of data. Of course, many of us, there has been data that's been generated in terms of our healthcare status. People who presented with symptoms of COVID, or people who had a cough, and then there were systems that were developed around the world to do rapid diagnosis or prognosis of COVID and COVID trends. And we are still in that process, trying to figure out where is the next variant. And for that, we are potentially harnessing the enormous amount of data that's being generated everywhere. So very quickly, I'll go to each one of you to say, is there some brilliant, blinding new learning you had over the last 2 years of pandemic living that changed your thinking about data governance? Is there something new we have to address and approach as we think about healthcare data? Because the next pandemic, or even the current one, is just around the corner. And how do we make sure that we can actually pool all this information to protect everybody around the world? And if I could ask Suhail for you to go first, then I'll ask Shamika and close with Geraldine.
Sure. I think that, of course, there have been so many learnings during this pandemic. One of the chief learnings has been, of course, that this is not really a luxury. Digital tools and digital communication is more of a necessity. Now, as to what I think regarding data governance specifically has really come to the forefront is about redressal mechanisms, because, and not just redressal mechanisms, but who actually has the heft on the global stage to implement those mechanisms. Now, if you look at very recently in the EU, there have been a spate of judgments against some of the largest corporations on earth regarding antitrust issues and user privacy concerns and so on. I was reading about a recent judgment that just came out very, very recently in France, actually. Now, we have to ask ourselves the question, though, to what extent, for example, can India, simply because I'm from there, could also come up with that type of a judgment against one of these corporations? Or maybe an even smaller country, what could Sri Lanka do or Nepal do, even if there was incontrovertible evidence that something had been misused? How can that redressal actually be achieved? And this goes maybe even beyond just the laws on the books, but actually the power on the world stage that some of these nations can and cannot wield. So I think that has become very, very relevant right now in the pandemic, more so than ever before.
Thank you, Suhail. Shamika?
Yeah, let me share two things. One is, remember when the genome code of the COVID-19 was shared in January of, I think in 2020 by China, and immediately then the rest of the world came together to develop vaccines. Now that was a lightning rod moment for me. Now that's the power of data. That's the power of data sharing for the larger goods, addressing global challenges. So that was really a proud moments, and we talked a lot about that. The second was the sad story, was when we were in lockdowns, sitting here in my own house in Geneva, I did my work. My daughter went to, did her school. We talked to doctors. We did everything, we were at home, but we managed. But I know many countries that we work, they were not just locked down, they were totally locked out of socioeconomic connections they had. Kids could not go to school. People could not work, and forget getting advice from doctors on internet. So you see, it was that lockdown was totally a lockout of the socioeconomic system. And that showed to me how dangerous this data divide could become. And I never realized it could be that, we always talk about the data divide, but it was so apparent, this connectivity divide. It was so apparent, it was so scary. What happened to people who did not have access to internet?
Great, thank you for that, Shamika. Geraldine.
Yeah, maybe two quick learnings. At the beginning of the pandemic, Germany hosted a nationwide hackathon to see how digital powers could aid us through the pandemic. And it was a great exposure of everything that is not digitized in Germany, and the fact that we, at least then, kept every nurse shift, every hospital bed distributed in analog data form, and no digital data was being gathered in the health system, basically. So that was a big shock to many, and of course many got busy to change that up. And the second thing I wanted to point out is really a shout out to friends and people whose work I admire. I just put the link in the chat, called Hippo AI, and they've really started to emerge during the pandemic. It's a foundation that's created an open data standard for health data. And are busy. Their first example was that they started to work on was breast cancer data, to really be a complete game changer in the field of health data. They see themselves as a data stewardship entity, and are really starting to unlock important data sets to be able to contribute again to creation of new innovative services, analysis, academic work in this sector, instead of locking it up, which is really the process that we're seeing in healthcare systems today. Big tech companies or other entities, pharmaceutical companies, etc., taking what could be public data or personal data and privatizing it for their monetary reasons. So I think the work of Hippo AI is so important and forward-thinking, especially whilst Europe, in particular Germany, is locking up the patent for the vaccine in order to protect our GDP. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, Geraldine. And of course, there's so much more to dive into as we think about data governance as it relates to healthcare, as you mentioned, Geraldine. Creating a data commons along the lines of what Hippo AI and others are doing is enormously important. The sharing of the genome code, enormously important. At the same time, when we're talking about healthcare data, everybody starts getting a little bit antsy because you worry about privacy and abuse of data if it kind of goes to the wrong place. Questions from the audience. Jade, I will turn to you to help us navigate through some great questions that have come through.
Great, thank you. Apologies. Great, thank you. So we do have a few questions in the chat. Someone asked, how might the potential fragmentation of the global internet affect the way in which data flows throughout the international system?
Okay, who'd like to take that? Maybe Shamika, you want to give it a shot?
Yeah, I think I can say a few things. I think the fragmentation is bad on all fronts. Fragmentation creates oligopolistic, tendencies in some countries. Fragmentation creates government taking over everybody's life in some situations. Fragmentation kills competition, and fragmentation kills technological advancement, innovation, because more and more you cannot share, more and more you cannot talk to each other, more and you cannot deal with each other. That's the fragmentation. We are creating walls and being in our little prisons, and that's not good. And it is especially not good for developing countries, because they will be at the receiving end of all the fallouts of this fragmentation of the governance systems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. And if I may add to that, I think that fragmentation really leads to significant hurdles when it comes to access and differentiated levels of access. Now, of course, I completely agree that the predominant models today is definitely a more corporate-led model in the US, a more citizenry/government rights or rights-led model in the UK, in the EU, and a more authoritarian model in China. But if we look at a very extreme case, just to sort of set the stage of what fragmentation can really look like, would be the case of North Korea, which is an island out on its own as far as internet governance is concerned. Now, what that leads to is that the citizens of that population do not have access to a vast number of different technologies that the rest of the world has access to. And the internet, unlike the radio or television, is two-way communication. I mean, FM radio. The internet is two-way communication. So if you don't have access to, let's say, YouTube, to use a very like pedestrian example, then that also means that not only can you not view those YouTube videos, you also cannot produce YouTube videos, you cannot produce content. And today there are many very well-to-do content creators on YouTube. So if you are in a country which is outside of that particular governance framework, which says that very large platforms such as YouTube or any other platform, for example, is banned or not allowed, then it might take an inordinate amount of time for a local company to actually start developing the level of service which already exists in other parts of the world. So that gap in access is not one which is similar to simply, let's say, blocking a TV channel or blocking a radio station, because it actually also prevents people from creating on those platforms as well. But yes, that's my 2 cents on fragmentation.
Yeah, Geraldine, given your work in open source and open innovation, I'm curious about your take on fragmentation and how that is detrimental to the productivity of that system.
Yeah, so the creation of standards and maybe a new era of interoperability, I think, is two of the very pressing issues that we're facing at the moment. We've designed this internet for ourselves with all these lock-in systems and apps that don't allow us to, maybe innovate in a different way than we have been in the last 10 years. So the idea of that why is every chat app a lock-in system in itself? Why is every perhaps business platform a lock-in app setup in itself? And of course, big tech companies like Facebook will want you to believe that interoperability is something that could cause a security risk, because it's not in their line of interest. So I think those are things that we need to push for. Luckily, the European Union is starting to bring in more legislation in that direction, but there's a long haul to go. And again, creating seats at the table at standardization, conversations and bodies for people from developing countries is also something that really should deserve more attention. And maybe just one last sentence. I have a great synthesizer with ideas of data localization in many aspects and forms. But again, the concept of data localization and local data sovereignty should not lead to us creating new silos and locking out people who could potentially benefit from that data, especially in the global south.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. And sorry, just one more sentence that I would like to add is specifically the field of banking and open banking, which I forgot to mention. But it is such an important benefit of open data and cross-border data flows to achieve a system in the financial sector as well, which would allow people to take their financial data and allow that to be portable across borders when people are traveling or conducting business across borders as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that. Jade, back to you.
Great. One more question before we conclude this panel, but we had a question in the audience about multi-stakeholder models of governance that are inclusive, as we mentioned in the conversation, can create an awfully big table. So how can we balance the need for inclusivity and practicality in data governance conversations?
Okay, who'd like to take that? Easy question. Go ahead, Geraldine.
Well, I didn't want to jump in first necessarily, but maybe it's again a question of tiers and how do we create different levels of governance conversations that can connect in a meaningful way. So yes, a lot of these are global discussions we're having, and a lot of the data flows are global, but a lot of data is also gathered on a very local level, on a municipal level. And a lot of data regulation also needs to happen on that level, or the smart city discussions we're having currently across the world. So how can we involve create bodies of citizen representation, private stakeholders, academia, etc., as we've just outlined before, on a local level, on municipal levels, and then see how at scale those can connect to global conversations. So whilst I fully agree with everything that Shamika has also said about global levels of governance and the role that the UN should play there, I think we need to create these connected systems of policy making and governance in future in order for this to work.
Bhaskar, can I just come and add to what Geraldine said? I fully agree. We cannot just serve this, some big thing on the table, say now solve the problem. We need to take small bites. For example, issues of, we don't have definitions of, taxonomies. What exactly is data? There's nothing, there's no agreements on these things. There are no established terms of access to data. There need to be a whole discussion on strengthening measurements of the digital economy. And we need to talk about agree on rights and principles and certain standards. So there are nitty-gritty technical areas. Some multi-stakeholders would be interested, but then there are bigger issues of platforms where more different groups will be involved. So I don't think we can cut this in one big thing. We have to take layers and layers and layers of this data story and try to see whether we can agree with guidelines, some sort of principles, norms, that we start working towards, together in the same direction. It will take time. It's it's an emerging new world, but we need to set these things in motion before it is too late.
Absolutely. So Suhail, you get the last word.
Right. Well, Professor, I think, as you said, in a lot of these discussions, in the past especially, it has turned into a cacophony of voices. And that is definitely a concern. But I think that what we can use to sort of recenter these discussions is a sort of, to borrow, unfortunately, like a Silicon Valley phrase, would be a first principles approach as to what actually matters the most. What are we hoping to achieve in our first principles from these data governance frameworks that we want to implement? And I think that most stakeholders can agree that the chief motivation cannot be simply profit. And even large corporations agree to that. And it also cannot be simply surveillance or control of the citizens. And I think most governments also agree to that. And so we have to ultimately come to a decision as to what those principles are. And the principles that you laid out at the beginning of the talk from the professor at George Washington University are a starting point. There are many other starting points. To plug my own organization, the World Bank also has its own starting points. And I think that that's the real discussion that we have to come to consensus on. And as far as I know today, there is very little consensus on what those exact principles should be.
Yeah, so I think we clearly all agree on the need for governance. We agree on the need for harmonization of governance, so you don't have a patchwork quilt as you go from one country to another, one jurisdiction to another, one application to another. And we agree on a harmonized approach as being an accelerator for development, and not just an accelerator for development, but also to protect the most vulnerable. Because one huge concern that we would have is that data could be used against the folks in the global south who have the fewest sort of institutional safety nets. And then, of course, the pandemic has given us lots of issues to think about and reflect on. And Suhail, you're absolutely right. We can't think of profits as being the kind of the litmus test for how one determines this. Let me close with a sense of, and we know that we need a multi-stakeholder approach, which granted is going to be difficult, but you can't do without it. But let me leave us all with a sense of discomfort. This is an uncomfortable conversation. I'm sorry. As Shamika said, we don't even have a definition as to what data is. So we have to really go back to first principles and even before that. And today, if I just do a poll around this room, and ask questions around today, if I wanted to do a search on Chinese restaurants 5 miles within where I am, I can do that. I can put it in the Google search bar, and Google will respond with a whole bunch of answers to my query. But tomorrow, if Google says, okay, I'm not going to take your data, but every time you enter a search something in the search bar, I'm going to charge you 5 cents. How many of us are going to switch? How many of us are going to switch? You don't have to answer here, but just think about that. When you think about that, some of us may say, oh, I'm willing to pay 5 cents for every search. Then the follow-up question is, how many people can afford to pay 5 cents? And does that then create a new problem? So we are a long way off, but these are the kinds of challenges that we all need to grapple with. And thankfully, we have experts like the three of you helping lead this dialogue and help set the right conversations and the right frameworks in your respective organizations. Thank you so much. This has been an enormously enlightening discussion.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
so
That
much.
was great.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yes,
Thank
thanks
you.
so much for having me.
Bye.
Absolutely, bye-bye.
Bye.
We should continue this discussion.
Absolutely.
Would very much like that. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.